There's many key benefits to cover crops and goals that growers need to consider.
A couple farmers in Kansas, one has been no-tilling with cover crops. His organic matter is now 6%. He's changed his system.
Welcome to the FARMSMART Podcast, presented by Nutrient Ag Solutions, where every month we're talking to sustainable agriculture experts from throughout the industry. As the leading source of insight for growers on evolving their sustainability practices while staying grounded in agronomic proof, FARMSMART is where sustainability meets opportunity.
We don't just talk change. We are out in the field helping you identify products, practices, and technologies that bring the future to your fields faster. I'm Ryan Adams, Director of Sustainable Ag Systems.
And I'm Dr. Sally Fliss, Director of Sustainable Ag Programs. And when we talk about sustainability, very often we're talking about how a grower's actions or practices can help the environment. But it works both ways. The environmental improvements can help the grower out and the agricultural practices in the field as well. When we invest in promoting soil health through practices like cover crops, we are laying the groundwork for better yields, lower input costs, and even potential new revenue streams.
So in this episode, we wanted to look back at a couple really insightful conversations we've had about cover crops and soil health. And we're going to start with Dr. Chuck Weiss, Distinguished Professor of Soil Microbiology at Kansas State University. He has a great framework for growers that he calls the Holy Trinity of soil health. And over the course of his almost 40-year career, he's seen how the definition of sustainability has evolved over time.
When I first started in this business, we were looking at productivity and how to become more efficient with nutrients, avoid nitrogen loss, mostly from a productivity standpoint. Then things became more concerning with the environment. We were looking at water leaching or nitrogen loss by denitrification or gaseous losses, mostly from the lens of efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer. And then climate change became apparent. Then we were looking at carbon sequestration, nitrogen as a greenhouse gas. And now we're kind of in the era of soil health and how can we improve soils to be more resilient to climate change, how it can help with productivity, to supply nitrogen. So it's changed quite a bit over that period of time.
Chuck, do you feel like this is more of the same, or we're really getting into different practices and programs and solutions than when you were first looking at just nutrient use efficiency and yield?
You know, it's looking from a different lens in some aspect. You know, nitrogen efficiency or nutrient efficiency, you could argue, well, we're doing the same thing, but it is for a different lens. It's looking at productivity along with ecosystem services, with sustainability, and a much bigger picture, really looking at the whole system. And that's definitely changed the way I've thought, the way I conduct research. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But it's looking at what a farmer does day to day. You know, he or she is looking at not just nitrogen or just that corn variety. It's really putting the package together and how it relates to the weather, to the economics. And I guess in a science research perspective, we're probably advancing to the farmer level.
I like that idea. I often push back when we're having discussions, or we often touch on discussions of, you know, a lot of these programs that we deal with out there are pushing single practices, just do cover crops, just do no-till. So it's great to hear that transition of research into more of that holistic systems level thinking, because what we've seen is as you implement single practices, you're changing all kinds of different parts of these biological systems. So as you've worked in soil health, we talk to our employees and our grower customers a lot about soil health. How do you define soil health, and what are some measurements that you like to look at as you think about soil health?
Yeah, so there's lots of different definitions. I won't go through the official definition or 2 or 3 official definitions, but I think of it as a way to improve the quality of the soil so that we are a more resilient production system and also sustainable or more efficient with the water and the nutrients. Part of my research has been on the native prairie. And so I have the advantage in that some of the aspects of the prairie, which is very resilient, it's extremely water efficient. Obviously, it's nutrient efficient and climate resilient, how can we take the elements of that native prairie and apply them to ag systems? So what I guess I've been known for is what I call the holy trinity of soil health. And there's three aspects. Soil carbon is the first step. And carbon's important because, again, I'm a microbiologist, so carbon is the food for the microbes. So by having more carbon in the soil, then you're going to have more microbial activity, and that's going to affect nutrient availability and efficiency. But then the carbon also helps build soil structure. We use aggregation as a metric, but you could talk about water infiltration. But the neat thing that why it's a trinity is that carbon feeds the microbes. Microbes through activity, fungal hyphae help build aggregates. That builds the structure, allows for better water infiltration, capture that, and also stores carbon. So they're tightly interlinked. And so what we're trying to measure is then those three aspects. Now, the chemists could say, well, you should measure pH, you should measure this and that. But really, from my standpoint, those three things are critical.
So, Chuck, you've published some pretty big papers on the impacts of farm practices around nitrogen management and nitrous oxide emissions. Any big insights you could share from that?
Sure. Well, early on, it goes back to one of the first questions. But when we first started doing work on no-till systems, we saw that no-till had increased N2O emissions. I was at this meeting that I'm at now. We've got 32 years of no-till with fertilizer and compost added, and we're seeing a change in the soil system. As you get better porosity, better aggregate distribution, we're now seeing that no-till in nitrogen management, that we're seeing the same or less nitrogen emissions from no-till systems than with conventional till. So that's been an important observation, and it's really that long-term research. We're seeing a change in soil dynamics. The other thing is that we've done work now in, I guess, the 4 R's or the 5 R's, however you want to characterize it. But in tilled systems and early no-till, placement is important, timing is important. But no-till allows you to, I guess, maybe accentuate those 4 R's. Placement becomes even more important, timing becomes even more important. So that now if no-till is the same amount or less N2O emissions, we can further push the system to become even more efficient and reduce those gaseous losses. Different sources are important. Some are going to have more losses, particularly volatilization as ammonia. So urea, anhydrous is really key. But I think the opportunity is now is if we can get the price right, can we use some slow release products that would help extend the time when the plant needs that nitrogen? And that's, again, really important. It's a substitute or another way to get the timing right. And so the important thing, it's not one single product or one single strategy. There's multiple strategies. That's the good news and bad news. So you can't say, do this thing and it's going to work everywhere, right? There's multiple strategies. So that makes it more difficult to prescribe, but it also gives more opportunities for the farmer to decide what best fits their operations, whether it's surface applied or timing or injection or dribble. There's lots of different options that fits their operation.
Chuck, you mentioned that project was a 32-year project. That makes it even harder for us to help growers make the best decision in the field when it takes that much time to really see how that system is going to develop. But why is it so important to keep measuring a project over a long time span like that?
So a farmer is changing their practices, changing their environment, their soil environment. We've been doing this no-till now for 30 years. And if we would have done just a 3-year study, like I said, we were seeing this change in the soil environment. So what we expected to see after year 3 and now after year 30, the dynamics have changed. We've built up organic matter. So now that, we're getting differences in nitrogen availability. And that's what a farmer would see. I'm working with a couple farmers in Kansas. One is he's been no-tilling with cover crops. His organic matter is now 6%. Where a lot of our, I guess, conventional farmers are looking in the 1%, 2% range. He's changed his system. different microbial activity, nitrogen availability. And so, that's the values long-term experiments is if we would have started now, we wouldn't have that knowledge to help that farmer that's been doing these high intensity cover crops, working under those excellent soil conditions at 6% organic matter.
How does a 6% organic matter in a managed system compare to some of the places you're looking at native prairie organic matter? Just thinking about what we hear on the sustainability side of getting back to more native prairie, not that that's a bad thing, but when we're really intensively managing a system and can get up to organic matters as high as 6%, how does that compare? What have you seen comparison to that native prairie?
So that 6% is at the surface, right? So it's higher than the native prairie in Kansas. Now, if you're in Illinois, maybe it's maybe close to that. But for Kansas local conditions, he's above that. So his farming system is continuing to evolve. And so now he wants to know how can he take advantage of that organic matter, that nitrogen, and adjust his N rates. But he doesn't want to mine it either. Yeah, he's in a different world. And again, that's why the research is important. The other thing, though, what he's doing, and he's changing his system even now, he's now looking at perennials in the rotation. So he's going to go to annual crops for 5 or 6 years. And now he's actually last year just planted a perennial mix and he's going to graze that. Now he's integrating livestock back into that system and he's going to let it go perennial for 3 or 4 years and then go back into annual crops. Why that is important is that he's changed his fertility organic matter, his physical structure in the surface, 6 inches, 12 inches. But with the advantage of that perennial system, now he can rebuild nutrients deeper down to make it even more productive, which is more like the prairie. So a lot of the changes that we've seen has been mostly in the top 6, 12 inches. But adding that perennial in that rotation is getting more like the native state, that you have that whole profile, which is really important because as we see, the weather changes, weather variability, these drought cycles, we need a better profile for water, for root distribution to help us work our ways through that drought. And then when we have these intense rainstorm events, we have these 6-inch rainstorm events, then that water is going to penetrate and then conserve in that soil profile to help support the annual crop.
It is quite a system to think about from top to bottom, how all these different changes really impact things. You think about a place like Kansas where you're worried about replenishing aquifers. And as we tie all these things together, that's really what we're building in these systems is that resilience, not just for that individual field and grower, but really for, at some point, whole region type scales.
To that point, Sally, the kinds of practice changes that we're talking about here, it's not just like wrenching a part out of your truck and putting a new one on. An ecosystem is a complex thing, and a change here creates changes everywhere in the cycle. So, Chuck, how does your research account for that? And how do we drive home the point that we need to look at farming practice change from a holistic perspective?
So I'll give you a couple examples. One is that, we just finished a paper where we did analysis of long-term no-till studies globally. And what we saw was that when you implement no-till, then you also conserve water, right? And so what we saw globally in all these 80, 90 studies was if you're only single cropping no-till, it's a missed opportunity. Because you have the extra water, it allows you now to double crop. It allows you to add legumes in the system. You can do that with a tilled system, but because of the timing, you got to till after the harvest and then replant the crop. You've lost your moisture. You've also lost 10 days or so, which can be really, really critical. And what we saw with the no-till is that because of that water savings and the timeliness to plant, then you can double crop and then you can make more effective use of the water and the nutrients. And so it's that systematic approach. That's the advantage. And again, I'm a big proponent of no-till, but it's looking at that opportunities. And can you then push the system by adding compost or doing these rotation systems? On the bad news or a case is that what we've seen is that, with conventional till, we were worried about phosphorus sediment loss, right? And so no-till captures or reduces that sediment loss. But now it raised the issue. Now we got water-soluble phosphorus running off. And so the question is, which is worse? Is it that sediment phosphorus loss or that soluble phosphorus going off into the rivers and streams? So you fixed one problem and you created another one. But however, I guess my challenge is then we got to quit thinking at a single field. Can we manage the landscape? You're not going to have zero emission coming off that field, whether it's gas or runoff. Can you then start working on edge of the field practices to help solve the water soluble nutrients going off, create buffer strips or, other things that we can do to look at a landscape approach rather than a single field. So that system is not only internal on that field, but now, unfortunately, or because it's more complex, then we have to go much more at the landscape, which then means we have to bring in other disciplines, engineers, ecologists to look at those issues.
Chuck, we talked about a 32-year-long research project that you've been involved in. What is your favorite project that you've worked on through your career? You've had a lot of projects and a lot of interactions with individuals. What really stands out to you as a favorite from that career?
Oh, gee. Yeah, I don't know if there's one favorite. I mean, the research keeps me going, excited and passionate. I guess I would point to a couple things. One is, working on the prairie. It's given me a different perspective in how I can apply those prairie principles to ag systems. The other one that's ongoing right now is really the soil health partnership, where we're doing some research on these metrics that I mentioned. But the fun thing is, and the challenging thing is that we're working on farmers' fields. So we're working on large strips, 40-acre plots in that sense. And it's a joy to see some of the research being applied, but it's also humbling and challenging because the farmers bring me back down to reality, right? So, and that's good because then hopefully when I'm thinking systems, they're working it, living it day to day. And it makes me think a lot harder because it is complex and that's what they're working with. But it's really, I love the field days. I got some great students that are very interactive with the farmers. And so see that application and the back and forth between the people living it and what we're trying to do to help them.
We heard there from Dr. Rice how cover crops can play a role in promoting soil health. But that can be a big practice change for growers who haven't tried it before. So if you've thought about incorporating it into your practices, we have an expert cover crop seed dealer who can answer some of the trickiest questions about that practice, and that is coming up in a minute here on the FARMSMART Podcast.
FARMSMART is the core of Nutrien Ag Solutions' sustainable agriculture offerings, leading the field with growers to record positive environmental impacts while identifying and embracing new revenue streams. In leveraging practices and products and recording your outcomes, your reward for making informed agronomic decisions will be waiting for you in our digital sustainability platform. The data you input can help set a baseline, identify opportunities for continued improvement, and help qualify you for market access opportunities. We're here to maximize incentives and help ensure the legacy of your operation. Getting started with FARMSMART is easy. Log in or create an account with Agrible, then track your data and get paid. Getting started now means we can get to the future faster. FARMSMART, where sustainability meets opportunity. NutrientAgSolutions.com/FarmSmart.
This is the FARMSMART Podcast, and I'm Dusty Weiss, along with Sally Fliss and Ryan Adams. And Ryan and Sally, I know you guys know that I've got a little piece of land in southwest Wisconsin where I rent out some acreage to a local grower. Well, last spring, before he got planted, we had some of these really big washout rains that have been, causing problems for just about everybody for a while now. And when I was out there a couple days after that, I looked out over my fields, and of course it's southwest Wisconsin, so there's all these big rolling hills, and there was just a massive washout. We're probably talking about several tons of topsoil just washed clean off the field and sitting there at the ditch along the gravel road at the bottom. And frankly, it kind of bummed me out because that's a really big waste, and it's just going to keep happening again and again. So I've been spending a lot of time lately thinking about how I could convince him to try cover crops. Of course, I'm kind of dicey about approaching a grower about changing his practices. They don't always really take well to that. But what are some of the barriers that are holding back growers who don't want to try cover crops in a situation like this?
Dusty, I'd say is a great example of what we see in the field all the time, where when we go out and ask growers to do these longer term conservation practices like cover crops or reduced till or no till or edge of field treatments, they don't own the land and they don't know how long they're going to be cropping that land and who's actually going to make the investment into that cover crop going on the land, because there is an additional cost to it. And while there are other advantages over time, those advantages can take 3 to 5 years. And so if as a business person, you don't know if you're going to be around on that acre 3 to 5 years from now, you may not want to spend the money.
And I think another one of the common things we hear from growers is a bit of the unknown about planting a cover crop when they haven't done it. And in the course of a grower's life, they at best hopefully get 40 years to try putting this stuff out in the field. And there is some risk associated with changing your practices. When you have a recipe card that you know works and returns for you every time, it can be extremely uncomfortable to want to try a new practice like adding a cover crop.
So really early on in the podcast, we had a great discussion with Patrick Reed, Vice President of Sales at Lacrosse Seed. And from his view in Wisconsin, he's seen a lot of growers coming around to the idea.
Well, with the recent advent of cover crops, which I would call about a decade now, what we've focused on that entire time and have really ramped up efforts recently is on the training and education of the features and benefits of cover crops, what to watch out for, what to look for, how to do it properly, and make sure that our customers and their customers understand all the parameters of cover crops and how to effectively implement them into their crop program. Another key thing, to be honest with you, is making sure we have good seed supply. And that's always something in play. The products that are used for cover crops are grown in the United States and Canada. And based on Mother Nature and weather, supplies might be good one year and might be very difficult in successive years. So you have to plan ahead and make sure we have seed covered for the coming fall each year. And we want to make sure that these products are what customers demand, high quality, clean seed that's not going to cause them any additional problems down the road.
You know, Patrick, cover crops to a lot of folks might be a new practice at this point, but they've actually been around for a really long time, and you guys have been on the cutting edge of them for a really long time too. So can you give us a little more background on Lacrosse Seed and your operation there?
Sure. So Lacrosse Seed is a small seed distributor, basically covering east of the Rockies. We have about 20 sales representatives in the field working with ag retailers, companies like Nutrien. Our focused products are forage, cover crops, turf, native seed, and corresponding products that go along with those markets. We don't sell corn and soybeans, so we're what we call a small seed distributor. And in 2019, we're 100 years old. Based here in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We have 4 other facilities spread out through the Midwest, one in Madison, Wisconsin, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Ankeny, Iowa, and Lansing, Michigan. Those outlets help feed products and seed to the local geographies that they serve. In this business, timing is everything, having seed available when they need it. So with those locations placed strategically across the Midwest, we're able to get our customers seed quickly. So that's a big focus. We've been working with Nutrien and the legacy companies for many years, well before my time here at Lacrosse Seed, and they continue to be a very strategic partner for us in this business. And as Nutrien has grown over the last number of years, we have grown with them.
Now to get into the kind of the meat and potatoes of cover crops with you, when should a grower start planning for cover crops? And is it ever really too early to start thinking about what their cover crop management plan should be?
It's not. And in a perfect world, they start planning ahead at the same time they're planning the rest of their farming operation, which perhaps is late summer, fall of the preceding year to plant the cover crop.
What are some of the things the grower needs to think about or visit with their crop consultant on as part of that cover crop management plan as they're thinking about what you're kind of saying is a cover crop really for next fall, not even necessarily a cover crop for this fall?
Well, first off, they need to understand what their crop rotation is, what fields are going to go into what next year. And that will help dictate what cover crop species would be best suited to be planted prior to that cash crop the following spring. Additionally, and a very large thing would be to understand what goals you want to accomplish from that cover crop on your farm. There's many key benefits to cover crops and goals that growers need to consider when implementing a cover crop on their farm. A few examples might be sequestering nutrients, compaction alleviation, reducing runoff of nitrates and other fertilizer products. There's a long list of benefits that cover crops do provide. Ultimately, in many cases, could be an enhancement over time to your corn and soybean yields. But those things initially need to be considered by the grower as key aspects of what they want to accomplish on their farm. And then by planning ahead, you can actually implement those cover crops into your entire farm program for the year, perhaps adjusting your variety or hybrid selection based on what cover crops you want to plant, as well as rotations.
So if a grower is in the situation where they still want to plant a cover crop this fall, obviously their pesticide applications have all been done and that kind of stuff, what are opportunities around varieties or different mixes of species that they could select if they had a pretty aggressive herbicide management program that might restrict the use of the more common sort of rye or wheat cover crops being planted?
Well, their herbicide program definitely has an impact on what they can plant and when they can plant. In fact, the herbicide program is another example of something that needs to be pre-planned into your system if you're going to plant cover crops. One thing that's gaining in popularity is interseeding cover crops into V3, V4 corn. To do that, you need to have a clear direction on what herbicides you're using so you can enable yourself to even do that.
So, Patrick, when growers are weighing whether to make a practice change, return on investment is always going to be a part of that conversation. Certainly, there's a few different ways to look at the ROI. You can look at the revenue that you might make from certain carbon sequestration programs, and that's worth considering. But the long-term gains for soil health, a lot of folks would argue that that's where the real ROI is. How long do those benefits take to really kick in?
Well, certainly there's a lot of data and evidence to show that if you enter in cover crops on your farm, it's not immediate. You're not going to see returns quickly, but there is a long-term benefit to using cover crops in terms of corn and soybean yields, and then all the associated benefits. The society viewpoint of farmers has value. Society nowadays knows what cover crops are all of a sudden in the last 6 months. I would say 2 years ago, if you asked somebody in Minneapolis or Chicago or St. Louis, hey, what do you think of cover crops? What's that? Now they kind of know. They're hearing about it. And then all of the food companies and so on that are getting involved in sustainability, they want their food to be viewed as grown sustainably. So they're looking for opportunities here, whether it be no-till cover crops or other things, to have their products represented and grown in a sustainable way that they can market to consumers. When you really sit down and pencil it out, that first year, I'll admit it's difficult to say I'm going to even break even. That's why I always tell growers, if you're going to get into cover crops, start small, start easy, make sure you have a good experience with it, see how it works on your farm, and expand from there.
Patrick, as you're out in the field interacting with growers and crop consultants at field days or just doing farm visits to check on how these cover crops have worked out, what's the long-term benefit that growers or crop consultants get most excited about when you're talking to them about successes in the field?
Well, certainly overall improving of their soil health and preserving their soil for future generations. I think all farmers understand that. There's no doubt that continuous tillage and minimal crop rotations have an impact on the soil, and they want to be stewards of their land and take care of that soil and improve it back to maybe perhaps where it once was. That's something they all recognize and find value in. At this point in time, though, it's got to make sense on their farm short term as well. So it's all about understanding what works on your farm, being cautious to a point, making sure that you're not damaging any opportunities you have for corn or soybean yields or anything like that, which are rare but can happen. And overall, growers want to do the right thing and they want to take care of their land, and they see that this is a way to do that. And then with all the advent of carbon programs and all that, there is some excitement that once that's all figured out, that'll be a nice advantage for a grower to jump in a greater level and have that confidence to use more cover crops or no-till or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. So the next question would be around one of the dirty words we get into here around that carbon opportunity is the additionality piece. So one of the things that's required by these carbon markets is it's got to be a new practice to that field within the last 3 years. So we often get growers saying to us, well, what if I stop doing cover crops or I stop doing my no-till or go out and till up all my fields for the next 3 to 5 years just so they can sign up for a carbon market? You know, we try to respond to them that there's not the value there to do that because of all these long-term benefits. What's your response to growers that would consider or bring up that argument of, well, what if I stop doing this practice in order to get into something like a carbon market?
I think if that is a plan that they have, they're doing it all for the wrong reasons. They're already doing the right thing. They're already using a cover crop and providing the benefits that it has. And by stopping that just to get a payment out of it, that's really the wrong reason to get into it. I don't think that's a good idea. You're not really accomplishing anything if you go back and stop doing the conservation practices that you've already implemented just to have access to a carbon program. Not only are you wasting all that investment that you did for the last 5 years, you're going backwards and have to reinvest it again. Most of the time, the carbon credits are not necessarily going to cover all your costs. When you factor in the issues that you may have on your yields of your corn and soybeans or what have you, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it certainly strains the brain a little bit. But Patrick, as growers start to plan ahead for after this year's harvest, if cover crops are something that they're interested in implementing, that's not something that you can just flip a switch and decide to do, right? Probably worth reaching out to your crop consultant as soon as possible and having that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I would say, help out your ag retailer. If a farmer shows up at the ag retailer on September 6th and says, hey, I need 20,000 pounds of cover crop seed, without warning, he may or may not have it for him, thus delaying and causing problems there. Give him a heads up. Let him know that you're planning on doing this. It also allows you to perhaps get better pricing, to get a more optimum product. Maybe it's a certain mix that you really should be using, and so on. Timing is everything. Thinking ahead, planning ahead, whether it be the fall before or even just a few months. I'll take that.
That is going to conclude this episode of the FARMSMART Podcast. New episodes arrive every month, so make sure you subscribe to the FARMSMART Podcast in your favorite app and visit nutrienagsolutions.com/FARMSMART to learn more. The FARMSMART Podcast is brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions, and the FARMSMART Podcast is produced by PodCamp Media, branded podcast production for businesses, podcampmedia.com. I'm Dusty Weiss for Nutrien Ag Solutions. Thanks for listening.